The question came 23 minutes into the show, right after Johnny Cash had explained why he wore black. Carson had asked about it with that smooth talk show host cadence, leaning back in his chair like he was settling in for a familiar story. And Cash had answered it the way he always did, quietly, seriously, with no effort to soften it or make it entertaining. He talked about the poor, the incarcerated, the forgotten. He talked about wearing black as a reminder that there were people in the world who didn't have a voice, who lived in darkness while the rest of the country moved on without them. He didn't smile while he said it. He didn't punctuate it with a joke. He just said it and let it sit there. And that's when Carson did it. He leaned forward slightly, grinning in that way that told the audience something funny was coming. His voice had that playful edge, the one that made even serious moments feel like part of the entertainment. "Be honest with the audience," Carson said. "When you go home, do you take off the Johnny Cash costume?" The audience laughed. Not a huge laugh, but enough to signal they thought it was a joke, a little ribbing between two famous Johnnies, standard talk show banter. But Cash didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't deflect. He didn't lean into the moment the way guests were supposed to. He just looked at Carson. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The audience's laughter faded quickly, replaced by a silence that felt wrong for a television studio. People shifted in their seats. The band members glanced at each other. Carson's grin stayed on his face, but something behind his eyes changed. Cash's face was unreadable. Not angry, not offended, just still. Finally, Cash spoke. His voice was quiet, measured, and carried every bit of weight the silence had built up. "No, Johnny," he said. "This isn't who I am. This is who I'm trying to be." He paused. Then he added, his eyes never leaving Carson's face, "Who are you?" The silence that followed wasn't like the first one. This one had teeth. Some questions aren't actually questions. They're mirrors. The audience didn't know what to do. A few people laughed nervously, like maybe this was still part of the bit, but most of them were quiet, sensing that something had shifted in a way they didn't fully understand. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't rehearsed. This was two men on live television, and one of them had just stopped playing the game. Carson tried to recover. His mouth opened like he was going to respond, but nothing came out for a moment. He looked down at his desk, then back up at Cash, then at the audience. His smile was still there, but it looked painted on now. Of course, He trailed off. He tried to laugh, but it came out thin and uncertain. Cash didn't help him. He just sat there, waiting. Carson cleared his throat. Let's go to commercial." The stage manager signaled the band. The theme music started. The cameras pulled back, and for a moment before the feed cut, you could see Johnny Carson sitting at his desk, not looking at Johnny Cash, his hand rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to shake off something he couldn't name. When the show came back from commercial, Carson had regrouped. He was smooth again, professional, in control. He transitioned to the next segment with practiced ease, introduced the next guest, and the rest of the program went exactly as planned. Cash performed a song at the end, thanked Carson, and left the stage. But something had broken, and everyone who'd been in that studio knew it. Backstage, Johnny Carson found Johnny Cash in the hallway leading to the dressing rooms, not by accident. Carson had left the set the moment the camera stopped rolling and walked directly there, still wearing his microphone pack. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he needed to say something. Cash was standing near the exit door, guitar case in hand. He saw Carson coming and stopped. Didn't move toward him, didn't move away. Just waited. Carson opened his mouth, then closed it. For a man who made his living with words, he suddenly didn't have any. Finally, he said, "John, I—" Cash looked at him, said nothing. Carson tried again. Out there, that wasn't... He trailed off. He still didn't know what it was or what it wasn't. It's fine, Johnny, Cash said. His voice was even. No anger, no resentment, just flat. It's not fine, Carson said. I shouldn't have asked that. Not like that. Cash adjusted the guitar case in his hand. You asked what you wanted to ask. I answered. I was trying to be funny. I know. Carson stood there, waiting for Cash to give him something, an opening, a way to smooth this over, but Cash didn't offer one. He just stood there holding his guitar case, looking at Carson like he was looking at anyone else. Are we good? Carson finally asked. Cash thought about it. Not for long, just long enough to be honest. We're fine, Johnny, Cash said, but I don't think I'll be back. Because of tonight? Because you and I don't speak the same language. Carson didn't argue. He couldn't, because Cash was right. They didn't speak the same language. Carson spoke in setups and punchlines. Cash spoke in truths that didn't need laughter to land. And tonight, those two languages had collided in a way that couldn't be undone. Cash nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, then turned and walked out the exit door. Carson stood there in the hallway alone, still wearing his microphone pack, listening to the sound of the door closing. He never told anyone about that conversation, and Cash never mentioned it either. The interesting part wasn't what happened on camera. It was what happened after. Backstage, Carson's producer found Cash in his dressing room. The producer was a man named Fred de Cordova, and he'd been in television long enough to know when something had gone wrong. John, Fred said carefully, that moment out there, Johnny didn't mean anything by it. He was just trying to keep things light. Cash was packing his guitar. He didn't look up. I know what he was trying to do, Cash said. He'd like to apologize if... There's nothing to apologize for, Cash said, cutting him off. He asked a question. I answered it. Fred hesitated. He's hoping you'll come back on the show, maybe next month. We could... No, Cash said. The word was final. Not angry, just done. Fred left. Cash finished packing. And that was the last time Johnny Cash appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Over the next few weeks, people started asking questions. Why hadn't Cash been back? He was always a good guest. The audience liked him. But whenever someone from Carson's team reached out, the answer was the same. Johnny Cash was busy. Johnny Cash was on tour. Johnny Cash wasn't available. Years later, a journalist asked Cash directly, "You used to appear on The Tonight Show fairly regularly. Then you stopped. What happened?" Cash thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Johnny and I are in different businesses." The journalist pressed, "What do you mean?" "Johnny's in the entertainment business," Cash said. "I'm in the truth business. Those don't always overlap." "Did something happen between you two?" Cash looked at the journalist the same way he'd looked at Carson that night. Calm, steady, unbothered. "Johnny asked me a question on live television. I answered it, and I think he realized he didn't actually want the answer." The journalist waited, hoping Cash would elaborate. But Cash had learned a long time ago that some things don't need elaboration. The truth is simple. It's the performance around it that gets complicated. That was all Cash would say about it. But Johnny Carson said more, not publicly, but privately. People who worked with him over the years heard pieces of it. He'd bring it up sometimes, late at night after a show, when he was having a drink with his writers or his producer. Always in the same way. Casual at first, like he was just making an observation. Then quieter, more honest. "Johnny made me look like an idiot," Carson said once. "He didn't make you look like anything. He just answered your question." That's the problem. I asked it like a joke, and he treated it like it mattered. The person Carson was talking to didn't understand. So Carson said, setting his drink down. When you ask someone a question like that as a joke, you're assuming they'll play along. You're assuming they'll laugh it off or deflect or keep things light. But Cash didn't do that. He looked me in the eye and asked me who I was, and I didn't have an answer. Why not? Carson was quiet for a long time. He swirled the ice in his glass. Outside the window, Los Angeles stretched out in all directions, endless lights pretending to be stars. Then he said, "Because I don't know." The person sitting with him didn't know what to say to that, so they said nothing. And Carson didn't bring it up again that night, but he would bring it up other nights, with other people, always circling the same question, always reaching the same silence. That conversation never made it into any biography. It never showed up in any interview, but it stayed with the people who heard it, because it wasn't often that Johnny Carson admitted he didn't have control, and he definitely didn't admit that someone had asked him a question he couldn't answer. What Carson didn't understand that night was that Cash wasn't trying to embarrass him. Cash wasn't trying to prove a point or make Carson look bad. Cash was just being honest, and honesty, when it's not expected, feels like an attack. The question Carson had asked was meant to be light, a gentle poke, a way to say, "Come on, you're not really this serious all the time, are you?" It was the kind of question Carson asked 100 guests, and most of them played along. They laughed. They admitted that sure, maybe they exaggerated a little for the cameras. Maybe they played up certain aspects of themselves. That was part of the game. But Cash didn't play games, not about this. When Cash said, "This is who I'm trying to be," he wasn't talking about an image or a brand. He was talking about a moral aspiration. The man in black wasn't a costume, it was a commitment. And every day that Cash put on those black clothes, he was reminding himself of that commitment, to not forget the people the world wanted to forget, to not become comfortable while others suffered. And when Cash asked Carson, "Who are you?" he wasn't being combative, he was asking a genuine question. Because if Carson was going to imply that Cash's identity was a performance, then it was fair to ask what Carson's identity was when the cameras turned off. Carson couldn't answer that question, because the truth was, Johnny Carson on television was the only Johnny Carson most people ever saw, and maybe the only one Carson knew how to be. The divide between the two men wasn't about likability or talent or success. It was about something deeper. Cash had spent years trying to figure out who he was and who he wanted to be, and those two things were in constant tension. He failed regularly. He made mistakes. He struggled with addiction and anger and pride, but he kept trying. He kept asking himself the hard questions. Carson, on the other hand, had built a career on not asking those questions. He was charming, he was quick, he was professional, but he kept a wall between himself and the audience, between himself and his guests, between himself and, maybe, himself. And when Cash refused to accept that wall, when he looked past it and asked Carson to do the same, Carson didn't know what to do, because removing that wall meant being vulnerable, and vulnerability wasn't part of the Tonight Show format. In the years after that appearance, Cash continued to do what he'd always done. He performed. He advocated for prison reform. He struggled and recovered and struggled again. He wore black, and he kept trying to be the person he sang about. Carson continued to do what he'd always done too. He hosted. He entertained. He kept millions of people company late at night. He was beloved. He was successful. But he also kept that wall firmly in place. Neither approach was wrong. They were just different. Carson's way worked for television. Cash's way worked for life. And sometimes those two things don't overlap. Years after Carson retired, an interviewer asked him about his regrets. Cash mentioned a few things: marriages that didn't work, relationships with his children that were strained, but he also mentioned Johnny Cash. "I asked him a question once that I shouldn't have asked," Carson said. "What question?" Carson smiled slightly, but there was no humor in it.
I asked him if he was playing a character, and he turned it around on me, asked me who I was. And? And I didn't have an answer. Still don't. The interviewer waited, but Carson didn't elaborate. He just sat there for a moment, lost in thought. Then he moved on to the next question. That moment on The Tonight Show lasted less than 2 minutes, but it revealed something about both men that no scripted interview ever could. It showed that Cash was willing to risk discomfort for the sake of honesty, and it showed that Carson, for all his wit and charm, wasn't ready to meet him there. Some people live behind their image, others live in spite of it, and a few try to close the gap between who they are and who they want to be. Johnny Cash was one of those few, and on that night in the studio, he reminded everyone watching, including Johnny Carson, that the gap mattered, that it was worth acknowledging, that pretending it didn't exist was its own kind of lie.
The audience that night went home not quite sure what they'd witnessed. Some of them forgot about it by the next morning. Others remembered it as strange, awkward, something that didn't quite fit the rhythm of a late-night talk show. But a few people understood. They'd seen two men ask each other the same question in different ways, and only one had been willing to answer it honestly. Carson never forgot that moment, and neither did Cash, but they took different lessons from it. Carson learned to be more careful with his questions, to not assume everyone wanted to play the game. Cash learned that honesty makes people uncomfortable, but he decided that was okay because comfort wasn't the point. Years later, after both men were gone, people still talked about that exchange. Some remembered it as the time Johnny Cash embarrassed Johnny Carson. Others remembered it as the time Carson tried to take Cash down a peg and failed. But the truth was simpler than either of those versions. It was the moment two men, both named Johnny, both successful, both famous, asked each other the same question in different ways. Who are you? And only one of them had an answer.